Hi everybody, Mike McConville here one more time, Stratford, Ontario, Canada. We've got two very different guitars in today for two very different reasons. We have an Eric Johnson Strat and a very early Guild F-30. So first off, this Eric Johnson Strat seriously needs an edge dress. These frets are getting really sharp, and February's the month to do that. It also needs a fret dress at the neck junction to be able to sort of bring that action down. 11 to 49 strings we're setting this one up for, and we will give you, as always, a play-by-play. And of course, there'll be a compensated nut going in this as well. Quite a different story on this Guild F-30. Rico has had this guitar for a long time, and it's one of his favorites. Very light body construction. The neck has been reset and it was refretted at one time, but we're kind of running out of real estate here. That neck angle is pulled up again. Now luckily we have enough thickness in the fingerboard, and I have done a video on this a few years ago, but we're going to walk you through this again. So all of you Patreon subscribers are going to get a play-by-play on this very tricky job to correct the neck angle without actually removing the neck. When I touch that saddle with the straight edge going full length of the neck, there is still close to 1/8 of an inch gap here. So ultimately and typically what is done is the neck is removed and it's reset, and you've seen that in other videos that I've done. This guitar has already been reset once before. We're going to do something a little bit different this time. Let me bring it a little closer and show you this fingerboard. I'll explain our approach. So in the case of this guitar, because we have a nice thick fingerboard to play with, we're going to change the trajectory of the neck set by taking this fingerboard down. Now you can't always do this, but in the case of this guitar, the fingerboard's thick enough to allow it. So two things we're going to do to sort of buy back all that real estate of that neck flexing all those years. We're going to take more off this end, and we'll go down to 0 on the far end. So here's how we're going to correct that. We're actually going to take some real estate off this end of the fingerboard and basically go down to 0 at the neck junction. And that is how we're going to tilt that back a little bit. We're going to buy a little bit more by putting a higher fret in. And this will increase the saddle height so that we can get an accurate curvature, because the saddle that's in there is basically straight across. It's not matching the curvature of the fingerboard. So we're going to put a new saddle in, and between changing the neck angle by reducing the thickness at this end and leaving this thickness the same, that's going to buy us back just a little bit more on that neck angle. Now to increase it further, we'll be putting in a higher fret. So the combination of changing the neck angle and putting a higher fret in will increase the height at the focal point on the saddle, and that'll give us a healthier saddle that we can actually put a radius in and still maintain a good solid bite at the focal point coming from the pinholes. And there'll also be a compensated nut going on this one. This of course is Brazilian rosewood. Because there's such a high resin content in the wood itself, the frets tend to slip out pretty nicely. So there's the cross-sectional view of the worn fret wire and then the new 6105 fret wire. So for those of you who wonder what's the difference between a new fret and an old fret, well, here's the difference. The new fret is 55 thou high, the old fret is less than 20 thou. This is going to make a huge difference for the playability, and like I mentioned earlier, it will also help us to realign the trajectory of the neck to body angle and raise the saddle at the bridge. That's like 270. That's over 1/4 of an inch thick. So we got lots to play with here to sort of change that trajectory of the neck to body angle. We'll be doing a lot of leveling here, so I want to make sure that we've got plenty of depth in those slots. This is a 22 thou kerf saw for those frets after the fingerboard has been reworked. There's a lot of sort of finger gouges, which there usually is in the first 3-4 frets. By the time we level that fingerboard end to end, these will all be gone. It'll be like a brand new fingerboard. So I've got my tracer plate here to match the fingerboard radius. That'll be used to transfer to the saddle, which is right now that saddle is basically straight across. The new saddle will have a radius to match the fingerboard, and we'll verify that radius. As we work along the length of the neck, we'll keep that radius gauge handy to sort of check our progress. I backed off that truss rod nut, as I always do, and we're going to put a couple of drops of oil on those threads, and then we're going to snug it down again. I'm up against the plate at this point. I'm going to add just a little bit of extra tension there. For those of you that are following on the Patreon channel, you'll understand exactly why I did this. Now we're ready to start tapering the fingerboard. We want to take most of it off this end, so that's where I'm concentrating. The block, as you can see, is quite a bit thinner than the fingerboard, and that's exactly what you want. We're going across that radius, and I'm keeping in mind the trajectory of the string path. So it's really like a conical shape, like an old-fashioned ice cream cone, narrow on one end, wider on the other end. And the radius flattens a little bit, compound radius, towards the top. Now I have a straight edge here, and I'm kind of checking as I go to make sure we get a good neck angle here. It's looking really good. You can see that those marks are almost gone already, and they will be gone completely by the time we're finished. I'm liking the angle. There's a little hint of fall off here, which is good. Typically you would set the straight edge on there on the frets, you would slide it along and it would just kiss the top of the bridge. But this bridge has already been kind of planed down. This doesn't give you a realistic read. What we're trying to do is get more height in that saddle so that we can actually trace that radius to match the fingerboard. So we'll stop for a second and just check that radius as we go, and guess what? It's perfect. Did I measure it? No, I didn't. I've got my radius gauge, and it matches perfectly. I'm sanding the exact same radius that was in there originally. I don't have a hard metal beam that doesn't flex. I have a piece of jointed maple with a slip of leather in there, and this works literally flawlessly every time. I actually do an 8 count when I'm sanding. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, I want that edge to be sharp so that the underside of the crown sits tight against the wood. We'll roll it over once the frets are in, but before we put the frets in, we want to make sure that that outside edge is actually sharp to the touch. And it's looking awesome. This is looking beautiful here. We do have just a very slight high spot right here at the dovetail. So I'm going to work that independently. Now we'll switch back to the larger block, and now we're going full length. I've got a fret in the 2nd position, fret in the 11th position. The radius is bang on, no issue there. Before I go to the trouble of putting all the rest of the frets in, these first 2 surveyor frets allow me to verify that neck angle to make sure it's perfect. Now, what I'm really looking for is the distance from the straight edge to the surface of the soundboard. In a perfect world with a radius top that's very structurally sound, it should be anywhere from 1/2 of an inch to up to 5/8 of an inch from the surface of the soundboard to the underside of the 6th string. That's perfect. It's going to be just slightly proud of a 1/2 inch, less than 5/8, which in the case of this guitar, because it's so lightly constructed, and we already have a little bit of imploding across the sound hole, so now we're good to go with the rest of the frets. A simple tip I always give to my students is you always start at this end of the fingerboard. Now this was a little different. We did this surveyor fret 2nd and 11th to get that trajectory figured out. I'll start at the 14th fret and make my way back. Now the reason you start with a larger fret is because if you blow a fret, which you undoubtedly will over the course of the fret job, you can always move it up a space. If you start here and you blow a fret, you're throwing it in the garbage. Just a frugal little tip. What I'm doing here is I have a triangular file and I'm just kissing the top of the kerf on those fret slots for a couple of reasons. One is because just by the nature of the extrusion of the fret wire, nothing is a perfect 90 degrees. So there's a very tiny radius on the inside where the tang meets the underside of the crown. So this softens that top edge of the kerf to allow that fret to seat perfectly. It also means that the slot will receive the fret with less resistance, and just as importantly, years from now when someone goes to pull a fret out, it'll reduce the amount of chipping when that bead on the tang exits the slot. So this is where we left off last night on the Guild guitar before my camera battery died. So that is all done and filled and French polished. So what you guys missed was the fingerboard extension frets. I have shown in other videos. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you've probably seen this before, which is a lead puck that I kind of hold in underneath when I tap those frets in on the fingerboard extension over this very delicate soundboard to make sure that you don't end up cracking the soundboard on either side of the fingerboard. So that's all done. We're just going to flip it over and do the other side. So we'll bring you back in the loop here now and show you what we're doing. So we'll flip that around so we can get at the other side. So it has been filled. I did fill this last night. It just needs to be sanded out and French polished. So this is a very similar job to that Gretsch guitar you just watched me do, the 6124. So I've already gone over this with the electric hot knife just to make sure that all that lacquer stick flowed in to the void underneath the frets. And now we've got this 80 grit that we use just to get the real craggy stuff off. Kind of level that first. Of course, we've got a tongue depressor taped to the soundboard so we don't go scratching up the already very scratched up soundboard. We just don't want it. That doesn't mean you're supposed to add to what's already there. Okay, so that's our 80 grit. Now we'll switch over to 120. So here's our 120, that's the next step. Just getting ready to French polish this. Okay, so now we can take off our tongue depressor. So at this point we're just going to tape off. This is a low tack kind of painter's tape. We're just going to tape off the soundboard once again so we don't scratch anything. And now I can get in a little tighter right down to the tape to sort of sand off that last little bit. So I put peel and stick foam, quite flexible, on either side of that tongue depressor. We're wrapping that with 600 grit, and then we're basically finishing up the ends of the frets and preparing the Brazilian rosewood surface for the French polish. The foam helps the sandpaper to distort and slur over those ends and polish them up. And we're going to finish up very quickly just with a quick wipe with some 4-0 steel wool. I can get in a little bit tighter with the steel wool by using the tongue depressor. This is actually our radius gauge, but we've got a nice square edge there that gets us right in tight to the bottom of that fingerboard. And now we're ready for French polish. So I just finished with the French polish. We can now peel off that low tack masking tape. Now we'll go to work on the bridge saddle. Right at the very end, I'll buff that out. All the fingerboard work is now done. The new frets are in. We've got 55 thou a fret there now. But there's another little fly in the ointment. This bridge, if you look close, I don't know if the camera's going to pick it up, but you can see it was kind of repaired many years ago. There's sort of a piece glued in here. It was definitely filled and re-slotted for the proper intonation, which is a good thing because it intonated really well. But the issue here now is that saddle slot is nowhere near deep enough to support the new saddle. So I'm going to have to re-slot that deeper so that we have good solid purchase and a nice press fit on the new bone saddle that we're putting in with a proper radius to match the fingerboard. This is the setup I use for re-slotting or slotting bridges. I do this on my own guitars. I actually glue the bridge on. You'll see this next guitar that's on the way. I glue the bridge on first and then slot it on the guitar to guarantee perfect intonation. So I have these aluminum plates that I designed and made up and sell them to my students and anyone else who wants one. This plexiglass plate is an indexing plate. This is a copy of the Bosch Colt router foot. So before I flick the switch on the router, this clamp acts as a stop on the bass side. This clamp is a stop on the treble side. It's plexiglass, so I can see through it and I can trace the trajectory of the cutter before I flick the switch. And that is perfect, ready to go. So that's going to give us lots of purchase for that new saddle. We'll get a good solid footprint at the bottom of that slot. This is what I rest the plate on. 2 hockey pucks cut in half. The point pressure is on the side, not the face of the top or the back, but on the side. These 2-footed clamps with the rubber pads, they basically lock to the back, and then the actual head pivots. Between this pivot and those 2 points, you get 3 points of contact, and the hockey puck gives you just enough traction that the thing doesn't slip, but we're not crushing or cracking the top. Still, very delicate operation. One twist too much of that clamp and you'll crush the top, and this is why I've never been a proponent of using clamps or vices to hold guitars, because all it takes is, like I said, quarter turn too far and you could be into some serious trouble. So I used the radius gauge we made up to trace that onto the bone saddle blank. we'll just get the overall length here. I want to give you a couple of pointers about fitting a saddle in a bridge slot. A basic rule of physics is 2 to 1. 2/3 of the saddle should be in the slot and 1/3 projecting above the surface of the rosewood. We've matched that fingerboard radius perfectly. I've transferred the points of contact from the original saddle because the work that was done at the mill wheel all those years ago, 45 years ago, was very accurate. So the guitar tuned very accurately. So I'm sort of respecting that, transferring those points of contact at the focal point on the saddle all the way across, string to string. Now, when you fit the saddle, you have to make sure it's not loose, because if the saddle is loose in the slot, then the energy of the strings coming out of the bridge pin holes wants to tip the saddle over and bust the front of the bridge off. If the saddle is too tight, in other words, if it's kind of a wedge shape and you put that in like so and it's too tight, the tension of the strings pushing down will also crack the front of the bridge off. So not too loose, not too tight, just a beautiful press fit. That's what we're after. So now the string energy is transferred from the tip of the focal point down to the slot. Good and solid, no danger of breaking that off. Now I'm going to cut those values into the crown of the saddle so we got perfect intonation. When you're working on old instruments like this one, this is the type of thing that you got to be prepared for. We got a brace lifting here. There's also a crack in the back that actually Rico pointed out when he dropped the guitar off, and he had just discovered it that day. Here's another tip. I break up my feeler gauge set. That's a 4 thou feeler gauge, so you can use it for purposes just like this. One more task that we weren't really expecting. So there's a crack in the back, and this is how we're taking care of it. I'm going to give you a dry run on this because once I spread the glue, I don't want the camera to impede my progress. Okay, so this is what we've got. So this is a piece of quarter sawn oak, and there's a little slip of a foam and vinyl material. With two-sided tape, I've attached this foam and vinyl gasket onto this oak caul. There's a slip of two-sided tape underneath that very thin mahogany veneer. The side that contacts this very thin veneer, I run the surface of that tape across my forearm to reduce the adhesive strength. So we'll be spreading our hide glue on here, and then watch how we drop this into place. Once I spread the glue on that veneer, I just reach in, set this into place, and release. So you can see I've got that lead weight in there, and that's what we're using for clamping pressure, and that will hold that very thin veneer in place. That foam and vinyl gasket will flex under that lead weight and hold the veneer firmly against the back. Listen to the voice in this little tiny guitar.